Oops. There it is. Rice. Okay. Cool. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm here streaming every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30 PST, Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST. Today we're doing a Sichuan stir-fry that's called mapo tofu, which can look in a number of different ways depending on what restaurant you're eating it at. But my personal version that we're making today is loosely, pretty heavily inspired by my grandma's version of mapo tofu, which when I was growing up was one that she was making for me when we were living in the States here in California, which means that it has quite a few American adaptations to it, because it's basically how my grandma was getting a bunch of kids to eat something that kind of looked weird. So today what we're going to be using, in addition to a couple of different things, probably the most Americanized thing that we're going to be adding to our mapo tofu is going to be some frozen peas. But also I'm going to be incorporating a couple of things from various different cultures. So I'm going to be, instead of using doubanjiang, which comes from Chinese food, I'm going to be using some gochujang, which is a little bit sweeter and kind of gives it more of a sweetness to it. And I'm also going to be using a little bit of mirin, which is also comes from Japanese cooking, and also gives it a little bit more brightness and a little bit more sugar to it. So both of those things are things I don't know exactly what my grandma was doing, because I never had a chance to ask her. But all of those things are things that I've added to my personal version of mapo tofu, in an effort to sort of like come close to the way that she was making mapo tofu, which maybe it's close. I don't really know. I haven't had her mapo tofu in 20 years. I don't know, but it's as close as I can remember, so we'll see. If you have any questions for me, feel free and drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about mapo tofu or wok stir fries or anything really, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative or answer something. And hopefully I can answer somebody's questions. So if you're looking for the recipes, so everything that I cook on a stream, if you've ever caught one of these streams, everything that I cook on stream has a recipe video that always goes along with it. I'm almost always, when you see me cooking live, I'm probably cooking something that I have released a recipe video for. Those recipe videos, they all live over on my YouTube channel. So if you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel that you're seeing at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, it's the channel that you're already on. We've already made it. Good job. Those recipe videos, they all move a little bit slower, and we kind of talk through some of the decision making that goes behind why I do certain things in recipes and why I leave certain things out. And sort of just like where a lot of the inspiration for the things that I'm doing in those recipes come from. So if you're looking for that stuff, it all lives over on my YouTube channel. So definitely hop over there and check that out if you haven't yet. Yeah, happy St. Patrick's Day. Hello. Hi, Hermina. Hey, Delaware Smash, how's it going? Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone. I'm drinking something that's kind of green. It's more like weird blue than green, but it's close to green. It's a kombucha, which I think is charcoal. It's a hard kombucha that's charcoal activated, which is, I think, what gives it that weird color. But yes, I don't know how to make anything Irish though, so we're not going to make anything for St. Patrick's Day. That is not my field of expertise. So, to start things off though, I'm starting off, this is some crushed and minced garlic. That's what we just finished slicing up. and right now I'm getting to my ginger next. So you can see with ginger, the skin on the root of a ginger, the root piece of a ginger is very, very delicate. So it comes right off with the back of a spoon. So I have definitely seen lots of people busting out like potato peelers and stuff with their ginger, which you definitely don't need to do because it's so delicate. It will come right off with the soft side of the spoon. So save yourself a layer of finger skin and just use a spoon. One of my favorite hacks. Very, very often though, you will see me starting off with these two different elements, so garlic and ginger. And that's because they work really well as like the first source or like layer of umami. So if you ever had like Asian friends growing up and you go to their house and they have like stacks and stacks of garlic and ginger, that's because it goes in like literally everything that they cook. So almost every dish that I have ever written a recipe for, if it's savory, if it's not like a dessert, it probably has garlic and ginger in it. So that's not necessarily because we want everything to taste like garlic and ginger, but more because as we're like sort of developing umami and like building complex layers of umami, I find that it works really well to start with these two ingredients because they're so aromatic and very, very fragrant. And there's really no trick to doing a fine mince. I just switched over to my fresh knife, so this knife is very, very sharp, which makes these fine minces work a little bit better than my other knife, which was getting a little bit dull. So super, super important though. Anytime when we're talking about knife safety, make sure that your knife is really, really sharp. But especially with fine minces, they're a lot easier when your knife is really sharp. When they get dull, those fine minces, they can take a while, and you kind of have to go for a while before you get to a fine mince. Sengo, you did the Taiwanese chicken. Oh, cool, yeah. That one was one of my favorites. I love that recipe. Personally, I think the one that I liked more was the second version from the longer YouTube version, which is like comes from no real culture. But it has like a lot more traditional influences. So it has in the second version, it's a little bit more complicated. So you kind of have to do a little bit more work. I did both of those on the same day for a Super Bowl party. So I brought two different versions to a Super Bowl party. And I think my favorite was the more complicated one because it had like Thai chilies in it. And I think the Thai basil really like ties it together. And then, but my favorite part was that I had done a buttermilk fried chicken for it, which was very disorienting because the buttermilk fried chicken comes from like Southern fried chicken. So it definitely does not belong in a dish like that, but it worked really well. But thank you for trying it. That's cool. I'm glad that it worked out. Cool. Next up, I'm moving on to some green onions here. As you can see, my green onions are very old. If you notice that your green onions are starting to peel and like get like wither, that's not a big deal. You just pull off the dead parts and it will work out just fine. What I like to do though, anytime that you see me pulling green onions out, they're not coming out of the fridge. They're usually coming out of a glass or like a vase, and it's being stored in water. So I do the same thing with green onions. I also do the same thing with my cilantro. So anytime you see me working with either of these elements, it's not coming out of the refrigerator. It's coming out of a glass of water, and that's going to keep it fresh for longer than if you were to put it in the refrigerator, which would probably spoil within a couple of days, really. So. But for our green onions, this is still not quite freshened up. For our green onions, though, I'm going to do a similar thing that I do with pretty much any time that I'm working with green onions, which is I'm going to separate the whites and greens here. So if we look carefully, these would be the whites. They're a lot more thick and durable, more of the texture of like a normal onion, whereas the greens of our green onions, they're a lot more pliable and a lot more delicate. So if you were to throw these greens, you could throw these greens straight into the wok fry, but not a lot is going to happen. You're not actually going to get much out of it. Most likely it'll probably just fall apart, or even in the worst case, it would literally just disappear because they're so delicate, depending on how thin that you chop them. So what I like to do, I don't always do this, but very, very often what I like doing when I'm working with green onions is I like separating them. So I'm going to separate. These are my whites. They're really durable and a little bit more capable of withstanding wok fries. So I'm going to set these aside And these are going to go into our wok fry with our aromatics. So these are 3 aromatics: garlic, ginger, and the whites of our green onions. That's going to go into our wok very, very first. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the greens here and we're going to save these for a garnish. So these are going to go, these are actually not going to get cooked, so they're just going to go straight on top. So we're going to finish with these. So I'm going to do a slightly different type of slice here. I'm going to do, this is a bias cut, which is cut on a, as the name implies, on a bias, which means that it's on a diagonal. So I like doing that with anytime that I'm using the greens of a green onion as a garnish, because it kind of like holds a little bit more surface area. So you could take a look, here's a good one, where like, since it's on that bias cut, it's a little bit wider, a little bit longer, and it's going to have like a little bit more physical presence in our garnish. So that's our green onions. We're going to set those aside. These are going to come up very, very last because we're not even going to cook them. And let's move on. Yeah, Charles, how's it going? Happy St. Patrick's Day. Cool. Next up, let's do, what should we do next? Yeah, let's do our pork marinade. So for our mapo tofu, probably the most traditional thing that you can use is ground pork, which is what we're going to be using today. Mostly because I happen to have ground pork. If you don't have ground pork, I have done a mapo tofu with like literally any kind of ground meat that you can get your hands on. I've done it with ground turkey. You could do it with ground beef. You could do it with like really, really lean ground beef. You could leave it out entirely too if you're vegetarian. You could pretty much just leave this out. You could probably do it with tempeh or any kind of meat substitute. That will probably actually work just fine too. You could think of it as like any way that you would approach how to do a chili. It's pretty similar because a mapo tofu has a texture of it that's like very, very similar to a chili. Today we're using ground pork, but use what you have. If you're vegetarian, just leave it out too. That will work too. We don't need to get super, super complicated with our marinade because there's actually quite a bit of things going on in the sauce already. But I like to add something in order to like kind of set a sort of base layer of flavor to our meat here. That's just 4 tablespoons of soy sauce. And then this is going to be a 1/4 teaspoon of white pepper. And that's it. We're going to let that marinate. Maybe a pinch of salt too. We're going to give this a toss, and then what we're going to do is marinate. We're going to let this marinate. We want to let it marinate for at least 30 minutes if you're really committed. This is probably not going to marinate for 30 minutes because I'm not going to wait that long. But if you're really committed, it should marinate for at least 30 minutes in order for those flavors to really penetrate. Oh, what are we drinking tonight? Yeah, hard kombucha. I forget what kind of hard kombucha, but it's kind of green though. Cool. So that's our pork. This will probably actually marinate for like closer to 10 or 15 minutes. But if you're really committed to like developing layers of flavor, full 30 minutes at the least. Cool. Next up, I'm going to assemble my sauce here next. Super, super often when you see me doing wok stir fries, you will see me assembling these sauces off heat first. So very often if you're watching chefs cook in restaurants or even on street food videos and stuff, you'll see them throw this stuff straight into the wok, which is pretty common because in those videos, those guys are probably cooking the exact same thing all the time. I have not made this video or this recipe that often, although I have made it quite a few times now. But since I don't know it by heart and like still need to taste it to season, I love assembling this stuff off heat first so that I have a little bit of an opportunity to taste it before we kind of move on. So to start off, that was 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar, and then a single tablespoon of sesame oil. And then moving on to our fishier elements, this is how many tablespoons? 1 tablespoon of oyster sauce, which, as the name implies, comes from the fermentation of oyster. And then last up is my mirin. So last up, I'm going to incorporate a bit of alcohol here. So what we're going to be using today is a little bit of mirin. So this is going to be 2 tablespoons of mirin, which is Japanese like fermented rice wine. Probably more traditionally in a more traditional mapo tofu, you would see the use of, and I actually pulled this out but forgot that I wasn't going to use it. Shaoxing wine, which is like Chinese cooking wine, is probably most similar to dry cooking sherry, so it has a little bit of sweetness and a little bit of brightness, and a lot of like brightness that's coming from the alcohol. I actually love and like favor towards the use of mirin because it's a little bit sweeter. So I actually favor using that instead, even though it's not super traditional, because I like my mapo tofu to be a little bit on the sweeter side. But if you're trying to keep it super traditional, go with the Shaoxing wine. The same thing is going to apply to our gochujang, which is what I'm adding next. Probably the most traditional thing that you can use in a mapo tofu would be a doubanjiang, which comes from the fermentation of chili paste, excuse me. If you don't have it, or if you're trying to keep it super traditional, the more traditional thing to use in a Chinese mapo tofu would actually be the Chinese version of gochujang, which is doubanjiang, which again is the same thing. It comes from the fermentation of chilies, but it comes out of Chinese culture. I actually, again, favor the use of gochujang in this particular recipe, mostly because it has a little bit more sweetness to it. So again, in an effort to drive towards a little bit more sugar in my mapo tofu, I'm using some gochujang instead. And then the very last thing that I'm going to add here before we wrap this up is some black bean paste. So black bean paste, if you're keeping track, this is the one thing that absolutely does not belong in a mapo tofu. Has no place here at all. Where you would more commonly see the use of black bean paste would be in a noodle dish. So jjajangmyeon is a super commonly used for black bean paste. I don't think I've ever seen black bean paste used in a wok stir fry like this. Because it's really thick, but I think it works really well in a sauce like this because it kind of like gives a little bit of like depth of flavor, and like a lot of fermentation comes from that black bean sauce. So if you're keeping it super traditional, leave that stuff out, but I have to tell you it works really well if you're looking for it. Oh yeah, I forgot. Last thing we want to do is taste it. If it needs something, adjust. Mine needs a pinch of salt, and I think that's going to be it. Actually, I think it needs a little bit more sesame oil. So I'm adjusting the taste here. That was a pinch of kosher salt, and then just a little bit of sesame oil, because I'm noticing that the sesame oil is kind of getting washed out by the black bean paste. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so before we move on, the last thing I'm going to get to is our tofu. So, a fun thing that I noticed maybe 20 minutes before I started this stream is that I forgot to buy the right tofu for this mapo tofu. A mapo tofu has meant to be used soft silk tofu, which is really soft, really delicate, and works really well if you use with barely any cook time. So if you throw it in at the very end of your stir fry, because it's so soft and delicate, it will pretty much cook in the last like 20-30 seconds. I forgot to buy some, so what I have today is some firm tofu. Firm tofu is not the same thing. It is very different, mainly in the fact that it has a lot of bite to it. So what I usually like doing when I'm using firm tofu, I usually approach firm tofu more as a meat substitute because it is so thick and chewy. So what I'm going to do, I'm kind of like improvising today now that we're using firm tofu. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to par fry this. So I'm going to go for more of I'm going to lean in towards the tendencies of firm tofu, which is that it is a little bit thicker, has a little bit more chew. So what we're going to do today instead is give it a sear. So I'm going to coat this in cornstarch, and then we're going to sear it. It's kind of similar to how you would sear Mongolian beef. So this is pretty similar to how you develop the sear in a Mongolian beef. Is we would take, in that case, flank steak, and then sear it, or coat it in cornstarch, and then sear it on really intense wok heat for a couple of minutes before throwing it back into the wok fry. That does a couple of things, but mainly what it's doing is it's giving it a little bit more crispiness and more of a bite to it. I don't know if this is going to work, so we'll find out. Cool. So, for those keeping track, if you're trying to figure out how to make a proper mapo tofu, don't do this. Skip this step. This is not part of the original recipe for sure. But I always love improvising. All right. So if you're keeping track, this is kind of similar to how you would do a Mongolian beef, or actually, what I'm more thinking of is hongsha tofu, which is a deep fried and breaded piece of firm tofu. But we're actually not deep frying today, so we're going to treat it a little bit differently. So if we were doing a hongsha tofu, what I would do is coat this in egg first, and then go and drop it in the deep fry. And what that egg does is it gives it a little bit more of like a fluff to it because it puffs up in the deep fry. We don't want to do that today because that egg is not actually going to have any opportunity to puff up. So what we're going to do instead is just coat it in cornstarch, and then what we're going to do is do a quick sear on our wok fry before we're going to par cook it as a sear first, and then move it over. We're going to remove it, and then we're going to throw it into our wok fry after that. So the cornstarch is doing a couple of things here. The main thing that it's going to do is it's going to prevent the exterior of the tofu from getting kind of rubbery and overcooking in the sear. And that's because the wok fry is really aggressive. It has very aggressive heat. So if you were to just throw it straight into the wok fry, it might actually work out okay. But most likely what would happen is, unless you navigate it very carefully, is that it would probably end up overcooking. So you would get like really rubbery tofu because it was seared on the exterior before the interior really sort of started to soften up. This is more of a problem with steak or meat, because what we really need to pay attention to when we're searing meats is that it is properly cooked on the inside. So tofu, less of a problem, but similar concept, because the other fun quality that we get out of cornstarch when we coat things in cornstarch in a sear is that the cornstarch itself also kind of crisps up. So it is a really great way of getting to like crispy qualities in a sear. Is coated in cornstarch first. Whether or not this is going to work, we'll find out. I've actually never done this before, so this is definitely not part of my original plan. But because I forgot to get soft tofu, here we are. What's the best Asian sauce? Ooh. Honestly, I would go with one of the fundamentals. I think soy sauce probably. Go with the classics. The soy sauce. You can't miss with soy sauce. Go with the classics. People ask me all the time like what to get if you're like building out a pantry of like Asian stuff. What to get? Probably the first thing is get yourself some high quality soy sauce, and like a lot of it. Soy sauce goes in everything. So, and then from there it can be quite a number of things because it kind of depends on what you're making. But definitely there are a number of like pantry ingredients that go in a lot of the things that I cook. So we used a couple of them today. Definitely rice vinegar comes up quite a bit. Shaoxing wine definitely comes up a lot. Things like hoisin sauce, oyster sauce, those two always come up a lot. And then I would like more think of it in the categories of like what purposes do they serve. So if we're talking about like qualities of alcohol, definitely like Shaoxing wine, mirin, and sake all kind of fall into like a similar category of like the purpose of what those sauces are doing. It's sort of like giving like a brightness to their alcohol qualities. And then when I think of like fishy umami, I think about like oyster sauce, fish sauce, stuff like that. All of those have like a fishy quality to it in which we're like deriving some kind of umami from the fishy fermentation of the sauce. And then there's like vinegars, so you have like rice vinegar, black vinegar, things like that, all of which come from like, or like aid in building like the derivation or like derive brightness in a lot of recipes. Oh, the best complex Asian sauce, yeah. Yeah, that's tough. I honestly, I would still go back to recommending all of the basics. So definitely like doubanjiang or gochujang. Those are two like really fun staples to mess around with. Also like black bean sauce, another really fun staple to mess around with, and like throw them in weird places and see what happens. All three of those are also very, very pungent and like very, very strong and concentrated. So I would say use that stuff in very small quantities. Otherwise, you're going to overseason pretty quickly. But yeah, definitely, if you're trying to get into like wok cooking or specifically Chinese cooking, definitely start building out a pantry and experimenting. That's probably, that would be my best approach to it. Charlie, have I ever had a shot of Shaoxing wine? I have not, but I would guarantee you that it's probably very gross. Because Shaoxing wine is not meant to be drunk. Even like I have had sherry, just like plain sherry, and even that is pretty gross. So I would not mess around with it. I'm sure that it is drinkable, but it is probably pretty gnarly. But yeah, there's a reason why people don't drink sherry or like dry sherry anymore. It's mostly used for cooking now, because it's kind of a gross liquor, so or like wine. Cool. Yeah, totally. Cool. Yeah. Hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. We're waiting for our wok to heat up, and we're going to start searing some tofu next. My name is Wesley. This is Wu Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here streaming every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday at 6:30, Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST. Today we're doing a mapo tofu, which is like I guess my grandma used to call it a Chinese chili, which is pretty accurate. It's essentially like a thick sauce with like ground meat and some tofu added. So. It is a staple of like Sichuan cuisine though, and is probably one of the things that I associate most with the flavor of Sichuan peppercorn, which is like, that just reminds me that we forgot to do the peppercorn. But one of the things that reminds me most of the flavor of Sichuan peppercorn, because it is one of the more iconic Sichuan dishes, is mapo tofu. If you're looking for the recipes for what we're cooking, those always live over on my YouTube channel, so if you haven't popped over and checked that out yet, definitely check what's going on over there. All of the recipes, those live over there. That's also where the concurrent live stream lives, so if you're looking behind me, there's a laptop behind me, and in that laptop, I'm usually streaming to the YouTube channel, which is where all of the schedule of everything lives. So if you're trying to figure out what I'm going to be cooking next, I think that schedule goes out. I think up to 3 weeks now, maybe a little bit less than that. So if you're trying to find what I'm going to be cooking next, that's a good place to be. It's also where all of the recipe videos live. We have a couple of series that are going on in progress right now. I just released one that came out. Oh yeah, so last Friday the video that came out was part of a series that we've been doing, which is reproducing Chinese American classics. So yeah, last Friday we reproduced a fried chicken that comes from Taiwanese cuisine, or like a Taiwanese American boba shop called Quickly, and they have a popcorn chicken, which is like a snack, because Quickly's is like a snack shop. And I had a lot of fun with that, because essentially what you're doing is reproducing a version of Chinese cooking, or Taiwanese cooking in this case, that is super, super Americanized. So it has a lot of very Americanized and like really basic qualities to it. And then essentially what I like doing in that series, I'll usually do a second attempt, and we'll kind of deconstruct it and take a look at what dishes like that would look like if we were to approach it from a more traditional perspective. So in this case, popcorn chicken is super easy to do, because there is actually a traditional equivalent, and it is how you would actually make popcorn chicken, which is incorporated in a couple of different things. So in that more traditional version, I used Thai chilies and Thai basil, which is kind of like one of the two like quintessential things that you would come across in a lot of popcorn chicken. It is also, we had a lot of fun messing around with some buttermilk, which was really fun and interesting, because it kind of like smashed together like Southern fried chicken plus like Taiwanese popcorn chicken, and took a look at what the heck that would look like. It's very strange, so also really good. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel and check out what's going on over there. Lots of fun content like that coming up every Friday. This Friday coming up is going to be Japanese chicken katsu, which is going to be super fun. One of my new favorite ways of frying chicken is with panko breadcrumb. Alright, so to start things off, I'm adding some grapeseed oil that we're working with today because I forgot to buy peanut oil again. I think it's time to go to the grocery store. And what we're going to do is, so if you're following along, this is not something that you would normally do in a mapo tofu, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to sear my tofu, kind of similar to how you would sear Angus steak in a Mongolian beef. And our goal here is, hypothetically, I'm kind of improvising a little bit, but our goal here is to develop like a crispy exterior to our tofu, so that we kind of lean into the qualities of firm tofu here. So if you have been following along for the whole stream, more traditionally, or what you really want to be using in a mapo tofu is soft tofu, so silk tofu or soft tofu. In this case, I forgot to pick it up today, so I forgot to go to the grocery store. So I don't have any silk tofu, which means what I do have is some firm tofu. So firm tofu is very different from soft tofu, mainly in the fact that it is very, very chewy and has a lot of bite to it. So soft tofu is fun to play with in a mapo tofu because it means that you can throw it in really, really late, like at the very end of a cook time, and it will pretty much come together because it is so soft and delicate. Firm tofu, on the other hand, if you throw it in that late, it will probably be fine. It will certainly be edible, but it's not going to be the same. So what I like doing, or what I'm going to try and do, is lean into the quality of firm tofu that we have today and create a crispier piece of tofu that's going to kind of like be a more interesting flavor to the tofu, or like a more interesting texture to the tofu rather than just like straight up firm, raw firm tofu, which is kind of gross in my opinion. So if you're keeping track, the thing that you want to be using when you're making mapo tofu is soft tofu or silk tofu, which is really, really delicate, kind of pretty luxurious in texture, and is it's so delicate that you can add it at the very, very end of a wok stir fry, and it won't fall apart, or it won't be like undercooked or raw or chewy. It won't have that raw taste to that raw tofu has. Firm tofu, you can also do that, and if we wanted to, we could probably do the same thing with firm tofu, and it would be edible, but it is definitely not my favorite way of doing mapo tofu. So what I'm doing today instead is going to crisp it up. So a couple of weeks ago, I also released a Mongolian beef recipe, which uses a flank steak, and has like a crispy piece of flank steak that uses a pretty similar process to searing like what we're doing today. And essentially what we did was we coated our protein, in this case it's tofu, in a Mongolian beef it's flank steak. We coated it in cornstarch and then we crisp it up with a sear in the wok fry. So we're going to give that a full 3 minutes before we start flipping it. And it essentially what it's doing, so we're going to get a couple of things from the sear here. The main thing that we're going after right now is developing a nice crisp exterior to that piece of tofu. And that's like the quality of flank steak that you would associate with things like Mongolian beef, where that beef is like really, really tender and like has a nice bite to it, but also like kind of crispy, and it comes from the sear, which is coming in a couple of places. Number one is coming from the Maillard reaction of the sear, which is essentially when you put something on a hot pan and don't touch it for a while, it's going to sear, and we call that a Maillard reaction. The second thing that's happening is the other thing that's crisping is the actual cornstarch. So the cornstarch that we coated it in is going to crisp up. So that's why it's super useful to coat things in cornstarch before you sear it, is because part of what contributes to that sear and crispiness is the actual cornstarch. So, okay, Dazer, what's the best thing to use silken tofu for? I would say my favorite thing to use silk tofu for is this dish, which is part of why I'm so bummed that I forgot to buy it, is because it's so delicate and like such an interesting texture because it's so delicate, is that you can throw it in so late, like literally at the very end of the wok stir fry. You can't throw it in any earlier because it's so delicate that if you were to throw it into a wok stir fry and then continue to cook with it, it would crumble, and then you would have like broken pieces of mapo tofu, tofu. But any kind of like saucy stir fry, like a mapo tofu or something similar, the main thing that I would recommend if you're working with silk tofu is use it in something very saucy, like a mapo tofu. And then the second thing I'll recommend is throw it in really, really late. You don't, when you're using silk tofu, don't throw it in any earlier than the last like 1 minute of cooking, because otherwise if it's added any earlier, it will start falling apart. I also love using it. I think the other two places that I've used it are in both of the soup recipes that I've done. So I know I use soft silken tofu in the Westlake soup recipe and the hot and sour soup recipe. So there it is. While that's searing, I guess I can pull this up. There it is. Yeah, soup like miso soup. Miso soup also has silk tofu in it. Or no, I don't think it always has silk tofu in it, but most of the miso soups that at least the ones that I like, it has silk tofu to it. There we go. So I'm just gonna flip this and then we're gonna sear for an additional couple of minutes. I usually like to go for 3 minutes per side on sears. And as I'm flipping, you'll notice a couple of things have started happening. Mainly, the main thing that you're probably most present is that it has browned quite a bit. So there's like this nice browning reaction happening. And that's coming from a couple of things. The main thing that it's coming from is the actual Maillard reaction. But the other thing that's happening is that it browns up from the cornstarch. So part of what's browning is the actual cornstarch. Cool. So I'm just flipping this, and I'm going to give it another 1 minute on that sear, maybe like a minute and a half, and that's going to like give it a nice like all-around sear, and then we can go ahead and pull it off. Super important when you're using cornstarch in a sear is that you have to make sure that all sides are seared properly, or at least the majority of it is seared properly. Because what will happen is, and I have definitely made this mistake before, using flank steak too, which is really expensive to is if you don't properly sear it, what will happen is that cornstarch coating will come off in the sauce itself. And cornstarch is the same thing that we use to thicken sauces. So if you add that much cornstarch to a sauce, which is like probably a whole quarter cup or so, if that all comes off in your sauce, it's going to turn, like basically will turn into jello. So it will solidify and then turn into like a block. So I did a Mongolian beef on the first, maybe the second try. I think the first and the second try. I didn't properly sear it, so I pulled it out before it was finished searing. And what happened was the entire bowl of Mongolian beef just turned into like a piece of jello block. And that was a good solid $20 of flank steak that I wasted that day, so that sucked. Oh, does the flavor change if it crumbles? Couple of things happen. It does. So tofu, I guess. So a couple of things there. Soft tofu, it doesn't really taste like anything. In my opinion, that like is the #1 mistake that a lot of people make when they're trying to make vegetarian dishes. Is that they think that you can make tofu taste like something, which it will never do. Tofu will never taste like anything. So stop trying to make it taste like stuff. First off, stop trying to make tofu taste like things, because it's not going to taste like anything. It's just tofu. But the main problem that I have, if it starts crumbling, is that the texture will dramatically change. So you'll have a lot of broken pieces of tofu. So it will still be edible. You can totally still eat it if it starts breaking apart. But it's a real bummer, because the really interesting part about silk tofu is that it's so delicate. So if you get a piece of it in a spoon, you don't even have to chew it. That's what makes it. Soft tofu is really good for like if you had like dental work done really recently. So you don't actually have to chew it. You can pretty much just swallow it. And because it's so delicate, the texture of it is what we're after, is that texture of like really delicate, really soft and luxurious qualities. And if you break it apart, you're kind of ruining the whole point of soft tofu. So that's why I say it's super important when you're working with that stuff. Add it as late as you possibly can. Even in the Westlake soup, I also mentioned is that you could, even if you're meal prepping and you're freezing the soup, you could just don't add it, and then add it when you serve it on the table. And it will probably taste pretty similar, because you're not actually going to impart any flavor to it at any point anyway. So. All right. Finishing up my sear here with the remainder of my tofu. Similar process. What we're doing is we're laying everything flat side down. And then letting everything kind of have a good solid contact with the surface area of the wok. So we don't want to just dump this into the wok because we want to make sure that everything has a solid contact with the wok. So we have nice contact going on with the hot surface area. And that's going to allow us to get that really nice crispy sear going. There we go. Cool. And I'm going to let that go. That's going to go for another 3 minutes per side. 3 minutes on the first side, and then probably 1.5, maybe 2 minutes on the second side. Yeah. Does tofu absorb the flavor of cooking oil? I have never really experienced that. But mostly, for the most part, I usually cook it in neutral oil anyway, so it would generally not impart any real flavor anyway. Yeah, I have never really experienced tofu that tastes like anything. Probably the closest that I've gotten is like a braised tofu. So the Hongxiao tofu recipe that I did, which is a deep fried and then braised tofu. So it's deep fried in a cornstarch batter, and then we braise it in a thick braising sauce. I think the braising sauce is mainly made out of oyster sauce, and that's probably the most flavor that I've ever imparted on a piece of tofu. But it takes a lot of work. You have to basically cook it twice. So we are deep frying it the first time and then cooking it the second time. So it takes quite a bit of work. And I also like, what I like to say is when I'm working with tofu, especially in like Chinese cuisine, what I like doing is leaning into the qualities of tofu. So I think I like to stop treating tofu like meat and just treat it like tofu. And there are a lot of dishes in Chinese cuisine that are specifically designed for tofu, like a Hongxiao tofu, for example, in which we don't actually treat it like it's supposed to be meat. We treat it like it's tofu. And the way that you approach tofu is very, very different from how you would approach, say, like flank steak or chicken thigh, in that it doesn't have any fat to it. It also doesn't have any flavor to it either. So we're treating it very differently. So I very rarely will you see me try and marinate tofu because I'm not really going to try and make it taste like anything. I really just what I'm really after is the texture of it, which is why I love it in a mapo tofu because you actually get that protein and that flavor from a different source, which in this case is going to be our ground meat, so ground pork in this case. Good question though, yeah. Cool. While that's going, we can take a look at our finished tofu. This will need another minute and a half. Here's our finished tofu. We can take a close look. There it goes. So it has a couple of different qualities. So the first main quality that we're looking at is that it is nice and crunchy. Autofocus. Give me autofocus. There we go. So it has this nice crispy and crunchy quality to it, which is going to give us a nice bit of texture too. This is not something that you would traditionally do in a mapo tofu. But what I like to say is that if we're using firm tofu, let's lean into the quality of firm tofu, which is that it has a nice firm quality to it and a really, really solid bite to it. So if we're going to be using solid tofu, we have to use firm tofu. Let's use it in the way that it's intended to be used. All right, let's give this a flip. Cool. So same as I was doing before, we're going to flip everything after about 3 minutes and get a solid sear going on the second side. There we go. Oop, that one burned. One down. Cool. And just like with our first sear, what we're after is making sure that the flat side of our tofu, or the side that has the most surface area, is in really, really solid contact with a couple of things, but mainly the surface area of the wok, but also the hot cooking oil. We want it to be making good, solid contact with that wok, otherwise it's not going to sear, and what will happen is you are going to start shedding cornstarch off into the wok fry, which is not going to work out for you, as I have learned. All right. Cool. Let's give that another 30 seconds. Yeah, a little bit longer than that. Some of this is cooking a little bit unevenly, so I'm going to start pulling it out. There we go. And basically what I'm doing is I'm monitoring each piece of tofu because my wok is not cooking evenly. I think that has to do with the fact that I have a round bottom wok. If you're working with a round bottom wok, round bottom woks are very tricky for a couple of reasons, especially in searing though, because you don't have an even surface area. So probably if I was really committed, we probably could have done this on a different pan. But what gets really tricky about it is that since it has a round bottom, it will cook a little bit unevenly depending on where in the pan it's sitting. So these last four are not quite done yet. But really quick, we can take a look at finished tofu. So this is what we have going. This is going to be our tofu. We're going to add this. We're going to remove this. So we're removing our tofu from the wok, and then we're going to start par cooking everything else. So we're going to cook up our ground beef, our ground pork in this case, and then we're going to add this back at the very, very end. So. Mikey, you've seen me on gift recipes. Yeah, those are fun. Gift recipes are super fun. Hello to everyone just joining, by the way. I know lots of folks have been following this channel over on gift recipes, where I've been posting lots of stuff too. Those gift recipes, they all have longer versions. So if you've caught one of these streams before, you'll know that pretty much everything that I cook is reproducing something that I have done a recipe video for. So in this particular case, we're doing a mapo tofu for a recipe which was actually one of the, I think it was the very first gift recipe that I published. I think that was back in June of last year. So those recipes, they all live over on my YouTube channel. So if you're looking for that stuff, it's all over on YouTube, which is youtube.com/WuCanCook. So Mikey just mentioned that yeah, he probably caught one of the videos that came out. That was probably the Taiwanese popcorn chicken, which came out yesterday. So lots of videos like that have been living over on gift recipes, the subreddit gift recipes. But everything that I'm cooking on those gift recipes, I usually will try and do on a live stream over here. So I probably won't be doing the popcorn chicken anytime soon because it's not really something you can eat for dinner. But almost everything else, if it's something that you can eat for dinner, I'll probably be cooking it the next day. So I'll probably reproduce it. Usually those gift recipes, they'll come out around Friday, around that time. And every Monday, you'll see me cooking through that recipe live here on Reddit and YouTube. So. Yeah, cool. Cool. So I've removed my tofu and I'm reheating my wok. We need that thing ripping hot before we start cooking again. And then what we're going to do is we're going to move on to our pork and wrap things up. You'll notice that as soon as we start cooking everything else, the rest of this dish is going to come together in probably in about 5 minutes, maybe even less than that. Which means that if you're doing a proper mapo tofu and you're not searing tofu, is that this dish will probably be done. I could throw a mapo tofu together in like less than 10 minutes because it has so few things that go into it, especially with the soft tofu, which is raw, which we're throwing in raw. Cool. Thank you everyone for tuning in. If you haven't checked out what's going on over on YouTube, that's a fun place to be. We're working our way to 2,700 subscribers by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit that subscriber goal, hop over to YouTube and check that stuff out. If you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, you're already there. Good job. All right. So I'm adding another 4 tablespoons of grapeseed oil this time to my wok. We're giving it a good long yao, which is essentially adding cold oil to a hot wok and then giving it a swirl. And that creates the non-stick surface of your wok. We always want to add hot oil to cold oil to a hot wok. If you do it backwards, So if you add cold oil to a cold wok and then try and heat it up, everything is going to stick to the wok and you're going to have a real bad time. So super, super important for your non-stick surface is do that long out properly. All right, so I'm adding my aromatic elements first, so that's my garlic, ginger, and then the whites of my green onions. And then we're gonna give this a fry until it becomes fragrant. So use your nose at this point, but usually for me that's about 10 seconds, maybe a little bit more than that. And this is our ground pork going in next, which actually might have marinated for a full 30 minutes this time, because we seared. And at this point, what I really want to make sure is that all of this ground pork is broken up properly, so that we don't have any large blocks of ground pork going on. So I'm going through my ground pork. If you've defrosted it properly, it should come apart pretty easily. Cool. And we're going to give that, I'll give that another maybe 45 seconds before we move on. And that's just to give a little bit more cook time to that pork so that it finishes and cooks through. All right. Yeah, that's looking good. Cool. We don't need this pork to be fully cooked. It doesn't have to be all the way cooked through because it is going to have more cook time. But we do want to do the bulk of our cooking process at this point. So I'm looking for about 80 to 90% cooked before I add my tofu back to the wok. And then I'm going to give that a toss to combine. If you're working with soft tofu at this point, you should absolutely not be that aggressive with your wok tossing, because it would absolutely come apart in the toss. And I'd like this to be a little bit looser, so I'm going to add a little bit of water here. Yeah. Cool. I make beats too. Yeah, slices I do. Yeah. So if you're looking for the music, pretty much anything that plays under any of the voiceovers, any of the live streams, or pretty much anything that is associated to Wu Can Cook, that is all published under Wu Cooks Beats. So, Cooks Beats. There it is. Yeah, so that's all published under, some of it is published with my band, which is called Trace Repeat, but the majority of it is published under Wu Cooks Beats. And that's just a fun place. I actually have like credentials to do that stuff too, so I actually do have a college degree in music. But here we are cooking though. What do you know? All right, so you'll notice that I'm not adding all of my sauce here, and that is very intentional. I don't want to add all of that in case we over-season, which in this case, I don't think we need all of it because of the tofu in this case. But if it does need it, definitely add it. But if you don't need all of that sauce, definitely leave it out. Don't be shy about leaving out the remainder of your sauce. If you don't need it, don't add it. And the last thing I'm adding here, this is some frozen peas going in. When you're working with any kind of stir fry that has peas in it, you generally want to be working with frozen peas because otherwise they're going to turn out kind of soggy. You're going to have like mushy peas if you try and use like if you try and work with things like canned peas, for example, it's going to turn mushy. All right. Add in a little bit more water here because this sauce is a little bit thicker than I'd like. And that ought to do it. Okay, so the very last thing that I forgot to do, I will do it right now, is assemble a cornstarch slurry. So this element is probably something that you'll see come up in a lot of Chinese cooking because it is how you make thick sauces. So I think of it very similar to the way that you use pasta water in a lot of Italian cooking, in which we use the starchy pasta water that you cook the pasta in to create like thick sauces with things like carbonaras and bologneses and stuff. In Chinese cooking we do a similar thing, but instead of pasta water we use cornstarch. And just like with pasta water, we don't want to use all of it. We want to make sure that we don't use too much of it because you'll end up with a sauce that's too thick and like too gelatinous. But we want to use it to we want to monitor the thickness of the sauce. And if it needs all of it, use all of it. But again, if you don't need it all, don't add it all. Cool. And that ought to do it. Yeah. Good. Last thing that I'm going to do, I just actually killed the fire, but the last thing that I like adding at the very, very end is our Sichuan peppercorn. And I love adding that stuff really, really late for a couple of reasons, mainly because it will start blooming out the flavor when it comes in contact with hot oil, like what we have in our sauce right now. You can also add it really, really early, like when the wok is empty. And then toast it, and then you can get some toasty qualities from your Sichuan peppercorn. I generally don't like adding it in the middle though because it will kind of disappear into the flavor, and then you don't taste it at all. That ought to do it. So the very last thing that we want to do anytime that we're wok cooking, and I say this at the end of every stream now, is clean that wok. So super, super important. While the wok is hot, give it a good rinse, and pretty much everything comes off. So I actually think everything just came off. So while your wok is hot, it is still very, very non-stick, especially if you've seasoned it properly. So you'll notice that my wok is pretty much clean. I'm going to give it a wipe down with a paper towel, but I don't expect much to come off. If you try and do that after you finish eating, so if you wait like 10, 20, 30 minutes and then try and clean it, you're going to have a lot of stuff stuck to the wok, which is not going to be fun because then you're going to have to start doing stuff that you generally don't want to be doing in a wok. Those things like scrubbing and using sponges and steel wool, things like that. All things that we don't really want to be in that world when we're cleaning our woks. And just like our cast iron pans, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm adding a little bit of oil here, and then I'm going to give it a little bit of a swirl. And then we're going to coat everything in that oil. And that's going to prevent any kind of oxidation from happening. And that's going to do it. All right. Pop back over here. So I'm finishing this. This is with our greens of our green onions. So we're going to give this a toss. And these are very, very fresh. They are uncooked. So these were the very first things that we chopped, which makes them very delicate. And let's serve it up. That ought to do it. Cool. So that's my mapo tofu. We are improvising in a couple of ways today, mainly in the fact that I forgot to buy soft tofu, so what we're doing today is a firm tofu. I guess we could take a look, see what this tastes like. Oh yeah, that's super interesting. Really tasty. This is one of my favorite mapo tofu recipes. Mostly because it's a recipe that I've been tweaking for a really long time. So it's exactly the way that I want it to taste. But also because it has a really, really interesting texture to it. So that's something that I probably have not come across in mapo tofu before. So more frequently you will see the use of soft tofu, which we didn't have today because I forgot to buy it. So today I'm using firm tofu, and since we're using firm tofu, I'm approaching the tofu a little bit differently. If we were using soft tofu, I would have just thrown it in at the very, very end, which would have cut like a good 20 minutes out of the cook time. But since we're using firm tofu, what I did today was I seared it in a little bit of cornstarch on the like a very, very hot wok for a good 10 minutes. And what that gives us is a nice crispy piece of tofu. That's probably not something that you will come across in mapo tofu, because most often when you come across mapo tofu, it will have a very, very soft, very, very delicate quality to it. Kind of like similar to, I would say it's like probably one of the more iconic stir fries in Sichuan cooking, because it like relies very, very heavily on the flavor of Sichuan peppercorn. So it has all of those really interesting numbing qualities of Sichuan peppercorn. So, in addition to that, this particular recipe in particular is leaning pretty heavily into like all of the qualities of the way that my grandma used to make it. So the way that she would do it is it would be a little bit sweeter, and it would lean a little bit closer towards the way that like a bolognese or like a chili would be made. And that was probably because those were the things when we were kids that we used to like eating, were chili and pasta. So this is like more of an Americanized, or like more of a fusion approach to a mapo tofu, because it uses a couple of different ingredients that kind of make it a little bit sweeter. But definitely super, super interesting. Probably the most American element is the use of frozen peas, which is actually more common than you think in a lot of Chinese food. So, yeah, how did the firm tofu? Yeah, so it worked out really well actually. I thought it came out pretty well, and I would say like. I would not have attempted that firm, that sear without that cornstarch. If we did it without the cornstarch, it would have probably just ended up. A couple of things probably would have happened. Probably the main thing was it would have either burned, or it would have just nothing would have happened, and it would probably just turn mushy. So firm tofu has a really frustrating quality about it, in that it's actually a little bit difficult to work with. The main reason that I keep it on hand is because it's a fun thing to keep in the pantry and eat raw. I like to eat firm tofu raw as like a snack with a little bit of soy sauce. But today I'm actually cooking it, which means that we have to treat it a little bit differently, because that firm quality to it kind of like, yeah, it almost reminds me when you bite into firm tofu in a stir fry, it reminds me of undercooked chicken. Which is a little bit gross, which is why I didn't want to just throw it in at the very end of the stir fry like you would with soft tofu, because it would have like a weird bite to it that's not quite toothsome in the way that chicken is, but more like loose and like a little bit chewy in the way that like undercooked chicken is, and that to me is really unattractive. So what I did today is I leaned pretty hard into the quality of firm tofu that is useful, which is you can sear it really, really well. So you can sear it in the same way that you would sear steak. You can also sear firm tofu but you have to coat it in that cornstarch, otherwise it's going to fall apart. And I think if we had tried to sear it in the wok without the cornstarch, it would have probably just started shedding water, and then it would have ended up steamed. So we would have ended up with steamed tofu because it would have started shedding water out because it doesn't have that cornstarch quality. But since we coated it in cornstarch, it has this really interesting crispy quality to it, so we can take a look. And I actually thought it came out really well. It has this nice crispy edge to it. There it is. Which I think, yeah, I thought this came out really, really well. And like, super tasty. We have this really nice camera lens too, so we can zoom in really close. But yeah, one of my favorite ways of preparing firm tofu is using that sear. So it's also very similar to the way that you would sear things like Mongolian beef. So same way that you would treat like I better fix this. Same way that you would treat flank steak in a Mongolian beef. So when we're trying to get crispy tofu, same thing that we would do is coat it in cornstarch and then give it a really, really hard sear on really, really high heat. So cool. All right, yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Wesley, this is Wu Can Cook. If you haven't checked out the YouTube channel yet, definitely hop over and check out what's going on over there. Lots of fun content popping up over there, including all of the recipes for everything that I've been cooking. I know that someone mentioned the gift recipes channel earlier, so everything that pops up over on gift recipes, it has a much longer version. So the gift recipes, they're all 1 minute long because they're supposed to be gifts. So those all have much longer versions. They're usually about 8 to 10 minutes over on the YouTube channel. And in those longer versions, I like to talk through some of the decision making that goes behind some of the things that I'm doing. All things that I'm generally cooking on stream here. And I'll like kind of talk through some of the things that I'm doing, why I add certain stuff, why I don't add certain things. There's also a couple of fun series that are going on right now. The one that came out last Friday, which was a Taiwanese popcorn chicken, is a part of a larger hack series that I've been doing, where I've been deconstructing a lot of like really, really classic like Chinese American or just like in general Pan Asian American dishes that come from like really, really Americanized Chinese cuisine. So things like General Tso's chicken, honey sesame chicken, kung pao chicken, a lot of things from Panda Express and PF Chang's, and kind of taking a look at those like really, really American Chinese dishes. And taking a look at what the American qualities of those things are, which is super interesting with some of them, like honey sesame chicken, for example, which is essentially just American fried chicken in a honey glaze. So when you take that apart, and what I like doing is removing those American qualities and taking a look at what it would look like if you were to reassemble it without those American qualities, and try and approach those dishes from like the lens of traditional Chinese cooking and take a look at what that would look like, which is always super fun because a lot of those dishes are not meant to be cooked in traditional Chinese wok cooking. So the particular one that came out last Friday was a Taiwanese popcorn chicken from Quickly, which is a snack stop here in like the Bay Area. And the more interesting one, I think the more interesting one that I had done uses Thai basil and Thai chili, which is that particular version is pretty interesting because in that dish actually does exist in like traditional cooking. So popcorn chicken is a traditional dish that you will find in Taiwan, all over Taiwanese street food. But the Quickly's version is really, really Americanized. It uses garlic powder, chili powder, and onion powder. All things that just come from like American dry rub. So, and the more like interesting version that I had done, it uses a buttermilk deep fry, which is really interesting. So, if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to the YouTube and check out what's going on over there. Lots of fun content popping up, including all of the recipes for everything that I cook. This Friday coming up is going to be a chicken katsu, which is going to be really fun because I've never breaded fried chicken in panko before. So. Hop over, check out that stuff. We're working our way to 2,700 subs by the end of the month, so if you want to help us hit that subscribe goal, check it out. All right, thanks everyone. I'll see you soon. I'll be back tomorrow. We're cooking, I forget what we're cooking tomorrow. I think we're doing a noodle dish. I think we're doing jjajangmyeon tomorrow. So I'll see you soon. Bye. Some.
Friends at the table doing
talk slow. Come over and start up a conversation with just me, and trust me, I'll give it a chance. Now take my hand, stop and the man on the jukebox, and then we start to dance. And now I'm singing like, girl, you know I want your love. Your love was handmade for somebody like me. Well, come on now, follow my lead. I may be crazy, don't mind me. Say, boy, let's not talk too much. Grab on my waist and put that body on me. Well, come on now, follow my lead. Come on now, follow my lead. I'm in love with the shape of you. We push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too. I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room. Now my bedsheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with your body. 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 Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with the shape of you. When we can, we let the story begin. We're going out on our first date. Well, you and me are thrifty, so go all you can eat. Fill up your bag and I fill up a plate. We talk for hours and hours about the sweet and the sour and how your family's doing okay. And leaving, getting a taxi, kissing the backseat, tell the driver make the radio play. And I'm singing like, girl, you know I want your love. Your love was handmade for somebody like me. Come on now, follow my lead. I may be crazy, don't mind me. Say, boy, let's not talk too much. Grab on my waist and put that body on me. Come on now, follow my lead. Come on now, follow my lead. I'm in love with the shape of you. Push and pull like a magnet do. Although my heart is falling too. I'm in love with your body. Last night you were in my room. Now my bedsheets smell like you. Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with your body. 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 Every day discovering something brand new. I'm in love with the shape of you. Come on, be my baby, come on. 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 Come on, be my baby, come on.